I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Are taxpayer vouchers for private and religious schools good for education? Our guest today will tell us exactly what the evidence shows.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
Are school vouchers good for American education? Our guest today claims, after 30 years of study, that school vouchers do more harm than good. Josh Cowen is a professor of education policy at Michigan State University. He's written about education politics, about school choice, and culture wars in the U.S. for the Hechinger Report, the Houston Chronicle, the New Republic, Slate, Time Magazine, and others.
Josh Cowen is the author of the new book just out this fall called The Privateers: How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. Welcome to Freethought Matters, Professor Cowen.
Appreciate you having me. Thank you.
So can you explain what school vouchers are, how common they've become, and how much the public is being taxed to support religious and private education?
Sure. So in a nutshell, vouchers are any number of policy programs that divert taxpayer funding toward private schools. About 90% of those private schools in the U.S. are religious schools. So at their core, vouchers are tax subsidies for these religious providers of education. They are becoming increasingly common. So the first modern voucher program was formed in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, in a very small program. But over the last few years, and especially over the last 2 years, now almost 24 states have some form of a voucher system, and more are spreading along the way.
And isn't it true that when vouchers started, you were originally a proponent?
Yeah, so about 12 years or so after the first voucher program, about 22 years ago, I started as a young researcher on these programs, and I don't know that I was ever like a strong advocate in any sense of the word. I mean, I was a program evaluator, and what that meant was you go in with an open mind. Certainly was more optimistic that these programs helped kids and families than I am today.
Well, I was surprised to read in your book, excellent book, just a broad cross-section of the history and the issues and the contradictions. There is a connection between school vouchers and Brown versus Board of Education. Can you explain that?
So vouchers were originally proposed by a conservative economist named Milton Friedman in 1955. And he was writing in an essay proposing this idea just a few months after the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board that publicly funded segregation was not constitutional. Friedman himself, his record on the issue of segregation is a little unclear. He did say in his voucher essay, in footnotes to it, that in theory, vouchers could be used by families to avoid racial integration. But he also said, well, but families of color could use vouchers to avoid schools they didn't want to go to as well. But what's inarguable is that in the months and years immediately following Brown, segregationists looking to avoid the implications of the court's ruling did embrace the voucher idea as a way to basically set up a separate system that met constitutional muster. Didn't get very far in those years, in the civil rights years. And again, the first modern voucher program really didn't come along until 1990 in Milwaukee, not a historically sort of segregated state. But the idea absolutely did have its origins in the months following Brown v. Board.
So it's not just race. Conservative parents who want to self-segregate their children away from what they perceive to be whatever it is they don't like, they
Right.
can use vouchers to segregate themselves out, right? For
That's
religious
right.
reasons. Yeah.
And that's why I say that today's modern voucher push, especially in the last 2-3 years, is really calling back to its origins based on sort of the idea that parents can separate and isolate themselves or other children from their children using the voucher system. So in some sense, we're kind of going back to the origin story with modern voucher policy.
Well, in a way, it's because it's a white Christian nationalist movement for some of these people, correct? I mean, they want to segregate their children to only send them to white Christian schools.
Yeah, it's illegal technically for private schools, even not publicly funded private schools, to overtly segregate on the basis of race. But the way these voucher bills work and the way that private schools work in general, private schools can deny admission to anyone they want. And there's affirmative language in all of the recent voucher legislation that does say that voucher schools don't obligate themselves to following all of the state rules if they're taking state payments, as long as the school can claim its admissions decision is along the lines of their creed or value system. Now, again, these schools they can't write down that they're a white-only school. That's just not how it works in 2024. But they can segregate. They can require students and families to sign, for example, sexual morality pledges is what they'll call them, overt anti-LGBTQ language and things like that. So apart from the issue of race, private schools on the public dime using vouchers have a wide leeway, according to law, for what they can and can't deny admission on the basis of.
Well, this seems very unjust to me. I mean, where public money goes, public accountability should follow, and they shouldn't be allowed to discriminate. But that is kind of the point of these private schools, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's why you really can't disentangle this voucher push from the larger culture war issues that we're hearing about all the time today. It's no coincidence that I'm talking to you two today. And over the last 2 years, we've heard all about book bans on the issue of gender, fights about the teaching of race in public schools, 10 Commandments being passed as required to be installed in places like Louisiana public schools.
And we're suing over that.
Right. So all of these, right, it's all of this is happening at the same time as this push to fund religious schools has gained more momentum now than it ever really has before.
So you were involved, as you said, with testing the Milwaukee system in 2006.
Yeah.
And you used to think vouchers were helpful, but now you say they are fundamentally damaging to American civil society. Why is that?
Well, in the early years, when these programs in the 1990s were first started, first in Milwaukee and then a similar program in Cleveland, not too much further after, these were pilot programs. They were income tested, so you had to be have low family income to participate. They were overwhelmingly used by African American children and other children of color. The Supreme Court in 2002, in the first case to rule on vouchers called Zellman v. Simmons-Harris, sort of bought or accepted the idea, albeit in a 5-4 decision, that vouchers could be part of the policy portfolio to improve education for everyone. But over the last 20 years, and especially over the last 10 years, as vouchers grew from these small pilot programs with a few schools and a few kids using them to these massive statewide systems that we're talking about today, costing hundreds of millions and in 3 states above $1 billion already, we've seen some of the largest negative impacts on student outcomes that we've ever seen on any research question in education research history. So, very difficult to argue that these things are an academically useful intervention, quite the opposite. And so very quickly you have to turn back to these other things we've just talked about, the culture wars, Christian nationalism, to understand what the motivating factor really is behind these things.
So your whole book talks about what is the motivation behind that. It's called The Privateers. Who are these privateer billionaires and who are pushing school choice?
Well, if we're talking about school vouchers, we have to start with Betsy DeVos, the conservative billionaire, not too far from me, about 60 miles from where I am right now, in West Michigan. So Betsy DeVos has made no secret, right? This isn't a controversial statement of her support for these programs, long-standing 20, 30 years of history behind it. So she's lamented what she views as the decline of churches as centers of public space and community in American life. And she sees public schools as having replaced churches as the centers of many communities and wants to reverse that trend. This is all things she has said and has talked about in various public forums. The other billionaire that sort of has to be named in this conversation is Charles Koch and the Koch brothers. Now, the Koch folks are not oriented toward kind of religious nationalism or that's not kind of been their MO over the years. It's been more anti-government, what they view as anti-regulation positions. And so they sort of see public schools as one more form of government that needs to be unwound a little bit. And that's where these folks have the religious side of this push coming from the DeVos type organizations, the Heritage Foundation types, and the Koch orientation, which is much more about anti-labor unions, anti-government, anti-regulations that kind of coming together to break bread on this issue over the last 20 years.
And you also mentioned the Bradley Foundation out of Milwaukee. Isn't it ironic that Betsy DeVos, who wants to get rid of public education, was appointed the Secretary of Education?
Well, she's now saying we need to do away with the whole U.S. Department of Education. Some of this is about doing away with anti-discriminatory oversight that department has. But certainly it was ironic, and that was commented on at the time during the Trump years and during DeVos's nomination process, where she survived the closest vote of any member of Trump's cabinet for appointment. So it's always been a bit ironic, and it's always been a bit kind of, in my view, sort of a tell for the underlying motivation of these folks to appoint someone who's given her life's work to privatizing education, particularly religious education on the taxpayer dime, and has made public statements against the Department of Ed and is appointed to lead that very department she wants to end. I think that's a useful frame for thinking about how all this fits together.
I think it's so sad, if not tragic, that we used to have this goal of what it was never really a melting pot, but that our schools would be a melting pot. They used to be called our common schools.
Yeah.
And to see this totally, as you say, wanting to isolate and separate the division between people instead of uniting us through our schools. You mentioned the Bradley Foundation. Who are some of the other organizations behind vouchers, and what are their end goals?
So the Bradley's a big funder, the Milwaukee-based organization of not just vouchers, but most of the major right-wing political organizations today. There's vast resources involved there. A number of Koch-funded groups, the DeVos-funded groups. The big player here in this space in sort of the months that we've leading up to kind of our time today has been the Heritage Foundation, sort of as acting as a clearinghouse for all of these different pieces, both the anti-union, anti-public school, pro taxpayer funding of religious institutions, sort of run by folks today who really see recentering religion in American life as a fundamental policy goal. This is why vouchers accompany all these other sort of pushes in the policy spheres, like anti-reproductive rights and so on and so forth. All these things are sort of part of that larger end goal there.
They like to frame this issue as the rights of the parents. Well, what's wrong with the rights of the parents? Isn't that a good idea?
Sure, but when we're talking about public dollars, taxpayer-funded dollars, there's been a deep and a rich tradition in American history of understanding that when public money is involved, there are certain things that come with that, right? And the Constitution's made these distinctions, state constitutions made these distinctions, and at the end of the day, one way to think about this is public dollars can't be used to create second classes of citizens. And so one way to view taxpayer-funded versions of these voucher systems is, listen, I mean, the Supreme Court's decision in 2002 in Zellman said at the time, they put kind of a limiting factor in there to say, there's nothing inherently wrong with vouchers, but you can't use it to proselytize. You can't use it to exclude non-religious students. You can use it at religious schools, but you can't sort of use taxpayer funding for religious education per se. All of that jurisprudence has changed to more recent cases saying absolutely you can use vouchers for religious education. And so that's where we get into this sort of slippery slope when it comes to this parents' rights. Nobody's questioning the right of parents to educate their children in the manner they see fit, to homeschool them if they wish, to send them to a private Catholic school or evangelical school if they wish. The question is, do those rights extend to using public dollars to do so? And that's, I think, where the real debate is.
We are talking with Professor Josh Cowen, a leading expert on private school vouchers, author of the book Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War. And when we come back, we want to talk more about this movement and its connection to Project 2025.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name is Bill, and I'm an out-of-the-closet apatheist, meaning I don't really care what you believe, and I don't really think that you should care what I believe. I was raised in South Dakota in a strict Catholic family. I was an altar boy. I served Mass a lot of Sundays twice. The priest gave us this little card that said, "In case of accident, please call a priest." I don't really like that idea anymore, since I left the church about 40 years ago. Now, if you find me alongside the road after an accident, please call an ambulance and an EMT.
As a social scientist, I do think it's important to ask who, if anyone, these voucher schemes are benefiting. What if vouchers really are just an opportunity for kids who've been ill-served for whatever reason by their public schools? But that's not actually what vouchers do. For one thing, most voucher users, around 70%, were already in private school to begin with. And the voucher lobby knows this, even though they don't admit it. They market these things as new opportunities for kids, especially to leave struggling public schools. They don't want to admit it, and they do want to pull more and more children out of public schools. Remember, I said to get a voucher in these modern schemes, you have to be disenrolled from a public school. So there's a variety of ways they have to kind of do this. One new way, just a few weeks ago, ProPublica reported, you'll see in Ohio, the state's actually funding new private school construction. Keep in mind, 90% of private schools in this country are religious in some way. So the state of Ohio is actually using grant funding to just send to private schools to build new seats.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with Professor Josh Cowen, author of the new book, The Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers.
So in your book, you write that voucher programs are expanding while the evidence against them is overwhelming. What is that evidence again, and how can that be happening?
So in really quickly, over the last decade, as vouchers have expanded to statewide systems across the country, we've seen some of the largest negative impacts vouchers have caused on student learning, larger than almost anything we've seen on most research questions in education. You have to go to something like Hurricane Katrina's impact on test scores for kids who survived that,
Wow.
or the COVID-19 pandemic more recently. And the reason for that is very simple. I think sometimes it's hard to get your head around the size of those impacts, especially where there's this perception that private schools are inherently better than public. But the reason these effects are so bad is that the private schools that are elite and that are strong providers of education, for the most part, have not yet really gotten on board with vouchers. They don't take vouchers. They don't accept the children that might be using a voucher. Instead, the voucher using schools are subprime. They are financially distressed, not particularly strong, and they are the schools that provide those impacts, those negative impacts on kids.
So I was surprised to read in your book that the vast majority of private school students return to public schools. Why is that?
So it's a little different. So it's the vast majority of voucher users were already in private school.
Yes, that's right.
But about 30% or so did come from public to private school, and those are the kiddos that we see those negative harms academically on. And those are also the kids that we tend to see leave over time. So it's true that over a 5-year period, most transfers from public to private school have transferred back to public school at that some period. It's a revolving door in and out for the group of kids that have used a voucher to try to transfer and then to transfer back, maybe because it's not working for them so well. But yes, and this is an incredibly disruptive pattern for public schools to sort of lose kids and then see some of those kids come back over time. We know that that's not good for kids, and we know that's not good for the classrooms those kids are going in and out of.
Well, also the attack against our public schools, because many of these programs, they actually literally take the money away from the public school and give it to a religious or private school. And how do the administrators of public schools know how to budget? Isn't this a kind of chaos?
Yeah, and the most important thing to know about that is as any school administrator will say is, so what the money that goes with the kid sounds great, but those are the dollars that the state has earmarked on a per pupil basis to those kids. And it turns out that those state specific portion of dollars for public schools is really, really important for equity and for adequacy for those kids in those schools, because if you take away the state dollars, what's left is the local property tax base for schools to have to use to fund the kids who remain. And so, that's fine if you're living in a very wealthy community, but if you're not, what happens when those state dollars leave is the schools have to rely on their own property tax base, and we know that properties are a tremendous source of wealth inequality in this country. But what vouchers do is roll back all the progress we've made in trying to equalize funding through the state-based mechanism.
How do these private voucher schools harm LGBTQ students?
So there's been some great, unfortunately, great investigative reporting on this issue, particularly in Wisconsin, in Florida, and Indiana. And what we've seen are millions of dollars at this point. The number has been above $16 million in Indiana and several $1 million in Florida, where schools are just overtly anti-LGBTQ. So just putting anti-LGBTQ messaging on their web pages. They're getting a little better at sort of tamping that down and just calling it sexual morality pledges parents have to sign or kids have to sign. And Wisconsin, it's a little more complicated than just the dollars going there, because even though Wisconsin does have some pretty firm, you have to be fairly flexible in your admissions process as a Wisconsin private school that takes public money, but there's no oversight on the other side of it, which is the asking kids to leave side of it. So there's been Wisconsin Watch, as an investigative journalist outfit in your state, has done some reporting on this, where a lot of schools will just admit almost anyone that comes, and then they'll quietly exit them out over the weeks and months that follow. And that's a real problem. It's hard for journalists and researchers to track that kind of behavior, but we know a lot of it tracks along two issues. One, students' association with LGBTQ, either parents or LGBTQ themselves, or whether the student carries a learning disability. We've seen the same kind of activity.
Yeah, and I wonder what happens to the money. Do they get to keep the money?
It's a good question. So in some states, they pay vouchers. They use the voucher to pay the schools on a monthly or quarterly basis, where enrollment has to continue to be verified. Wisconsin's one of those states. In other states, like Iowa, next door to you, sort of, the schools just get one lump sum payment at the beginning of the fall, and they get to keep those dollars regardless of whether or not the kid stays there. So schools in that state actually have an incentive to exit them out and hang on to the money.
So final questions. What are Vouchers' links to the Dobbs decision, and what about Project 2025?
It's a good question. So I'll take the first part first. So 3 days before Dobbs v. Jackson rolled back 50 years of progress toward reproductive rights in this country, a lesser covered case called Carson v. Macon, the same 6 justices that rolled back Roe 3 days earlier, expanded the rights of private schools to take public money and to do so using overtly religious education. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, up until the last couple of years, there was not a lot of legal clarity on whether or not vouchers could be used for overtly religious education. The court had settled in a 5-4 decision years earlier that private schools could take voucher dollars, but they couldn't use them to evangelize or to proselytize. They had to, take all comers, as it were. What Carson did 3 days before Roe was basically say, actually, now you can use vouchers explicitly for overtly religious education. That's where you get things like creationism. That's where you get things like curricula that say LGBTQ families are wrong, things like that. Vouchers lead 2 of the first 3 paragraphs in Project 2025's education chapter demand vouchers. There is a foreword to Project 2025 in which vouchers, the author of the foreword, who's the president of the Heritage Foundation, makes vouchers as a litmus test for all conservative presidential candidates moving forward to support universal school vouchers. So vouchers are not just part of Project 2025, but they're actually the centerpiece of Project 2025's education agenda, alongside dismantling the U.S. Department of Education and rolling back rights for LGBTQ kids, teaching of accurate stories of race in this country, and so on and so forth.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Cowen, for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
The book is called The Privateers.
And thank you so much for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.